All right, welcome back. Today, we're going to demystify a real statistical powerhouse, repeated measures ANOVA. If you've ever wondered how scientists can actually track real, meaningful change in people over time, well, this is the tool they use. Let's dive in and see how it all works. So, at its core, what question does this thing even answer? It's a pretty fundamental one. When we track the very same people through some kind of experience, how can we be sure that a real change has actually happened? Whether it's a new treatment, a training program, or just the passage of time, we need a reliable way to spot the pattern. And you see this kind of question pop up absolutely everywhere. In medicine, right? You might track a patient's symptoms over several months. Or think about marketing. You could have the exact same group of people rate 4 different soda brands. In education, you might want to measure student confidence before, during, and after a course. In psychology, you might even test how enjoyment levels change after 1 drink, then 2, then 3. The key thing in every single one of these scenarios is that you're measuring the same people multiple times. So to tackle all those different scenarios, we need a very specific tool for the job. And that tool is the one-way repeated measures ANOVA, or as we'll call it, RM ANOVA for short. The core idea behind it is actually pretty simple. It's designed to do one thing and do it really, really well. It looks at the average scores from the same group across 3 or more different moments or conditions, and it tells us if the differences between those averages are big enough to be statistically significant. And hey, if you're already familiar with the paired t-test, the one that just compares 2 related scores, like a before and after, then you're basically halfway there. Just think of repeated measures ANOVA as the supercharged big brother of the t-test. It's an extension that lets you compare more than 2 measurements. So instead of just before and after, now you can look at before, during, and after. Now, like any really powerful tool, this isn't a magic wand. It comes with its own unique set of strengths and, well, some potential pitfalls. So let's take a look at both the power and the problems. Okay, let's talk about the good stuff first. The biggest advantage by far is something called statistical power. See, by using the same people in every condition, you control for all the random quirks and differences between individuals. Some people are just naturally faster or more optimistic, that kind of thing. Since you're comparing people to themselves, all that individual noise just gets canceled out, which makes it way easier to see the true effect you're studying. And as a bonus, this usually means you need fewer participants, which saves a ton of time and money. But you do have to watch out for a few things. Sometimes participants get better at a task just because they've done it a few times. We call that a learning effect. Or the effects of one condition, like tasting a really strong soda, might kind of linger and influence how they rate the next one. That's a carryover effect. Good researchers know about these things and design their studies to minimize them, often by using control groups or building in washout periods between tests. All right, deep breath. We're about to tackle the most important and, yeah, often the most confusing part of this whole thing. It's a critical checkpoint for your analysis called the sphericity assumption. So what in the world is sphericity? Let's break it down. I promise it's not as scary as it sounds. I know it sounds super technical, but just think of it like this. Sphericity is basically a consistency check. Imagine you calculate the differences between time 1 and time 2 scores. Then you do it again for time 2 and time 3, and for time 1 and time 3. Sphericity just assumes that the spread, or the variance, of those differences is roughly equal for all the pairs. Okay, but why do we care so much? What's the big deal if it's violated? Well, if that assumption is broken, if the relationships aren't consistent, our test can become a little too optimistic. It's more likely to shout, "Hey, you found something significant," when in reality, there's nothing there. That's a false positive, or a type 1 error, and it's a major no-no in research. The good news is, you don't have to guess. Your software gives you a really clear step-by-step process. First, you run a specific test called Mauchly's test of sphericity. Then, you just look at its p-value. If that p-value is greater than 0.05, great, you're good to go. Sphericity is assumed. But if it's less than 0.05, the assumption has been violated, and you just need to use a corrected version of your results. Simple as that. So what happens if you fail the test? No big deal. We've got statistical corrections we can apply. Your software will usually give you a couple of options, like the Greenhouse-Geisser or the Hunfield correction. There are some simple rules of thumb for which to choose. But the main takeaway here is that even if you violate sphericity, we have reliable ways to adjust our results to get an honest, accurate answer. All right, that was a lot of theory.
Enough theory. Let's get practical and see how this actually works with a real example, turning raw data into a genuine discovery.
So let's imagine a researcher. She wants to know if a psychotherapy program actually boosts student confidence. So she measures the confidence of 30 students at 3 different times, before the program even starts, right after it ends, and then again 3 months later as a follow-up. This is a perfect, classic repeated measures design. Now, even before we run any fancy stats, just look at the data. You can see the story taking shape right there in the chart. The average confidence score starts down at 19, it jumps up to almost 22 right after the program, and then it keeps on climbing all the way to 25 3 months later. The data is telling us something, but now we need the ANOVA to prove it.
And boom, here's what the final output from our software looks like. I know, it's a bunch of numbers and letters, but don't get intimidated. Just focus on one thing, that p-value at the end. See how it says p is less than 0.001? Since that is way, way smaller than our usual cutoff of 0.05, we know we found a statistically significant result.
So what does all that statistical gobbledygook actually mean? It means we can say loud and clear, the intervention worked. The program didn't just cause some random blip in the data. It led to a real, measurable, and statistically significant increase in student confidence over time.
And look, this is way more than just an academic exercise, right? This kind of analysis has a huge impact in the real world, helping us make really important decisions. Let's check out a real published study from 2013. Researchers wanted to know if a special program could improve high school students' knowledge and attitudes about physical activity. So what did they do? They measured the students before the program, right after, and then again 1 month later. It's a perfect real-world use case for RM and ANOVA. And their findings? It's a perfect example of this in action. They found a huge, highly significant increase in the students' knowledge right after the program. But more importantly, that increase was still there a month later. RM ANOVA gave them the hard evidence to prove that their educational program didn't just work, it had a lasting impact. So you see, from clinical trials that test new drugs to educational programs in schools, repeated measures ANOVA gives us this incredibly clear lens to see how things change. It helps us separate the real, meaningful effects from just random chance. So the next time you see a headline about a new program that's proven to work over time, you'll know exactly what powerful tool was likely behind that discovery. Thanks for tuning in.